So a tweet popped up in my feed last week from a man I don't know. He said, 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that in 2025, the sentiment that comes most readily to mind is only the lesbians can save us now. Strange, but true. I'm going to talk about why I set up the lesbian intervention and why it was so essential to the For Women Scotland case about the meaning of the words sex and women. And we do owe those women, those three brilliant women, an enormous debt. They fought for 7 years before the Supreme Court finally confirmed what everybody already knew, that a man cannot be a woman and most definitely cannot be a lesbian. Seriously, for several years before the case, I'd been concerned that the arguments being made by the women's rights movement generally was not taking account of the needs or the perspective of lesbians. Most of the arguments being made then were about safe spaces. And I've always thought that for lesbians, it's not about safe spaces. It's just about women's space, or especially lesbian space. And when I started speaking about this some years ago, I was assured that the only difference for lesbians was that we needed to include, well, we were being forced by the ideology to include men in our dating pool, but that in all other respects, we were merely a subset of women affected in all the same ways. So the lesbian perspective wasn't going to change anybody's mind. On the contrary, in my opinion, it was very significant to the outcome of this particular case. So heterosexual women are affected by men being counted as women in particular circumstances, when they want to use the toilet, when they're in prison or communal accommodation, when they want to compete in women's sports or get changed at the swimming pool, when they need intimate care. Some of those situations are extremely serious, extremely intrusive, and extremely humiliating if a man is present, particularly a man pretending to be a woman, who I think is the worst type of man. However extreme those situations, you can nevertheless describe non-lesbian women's need for women-only services to be situational. They're needed at times like those I've described. And although the timescales vary, they're mostly short-term. When that particular circumstance is over, when you finish changing or you get out of prison, it's not so important that the people around you are exclusively women. But lesbians' need for women-only space is foundational, especially for those like myself who choose to spend all or most, at least, of our private lives with other lesbians. It's the heart of our daily lives. It's who we are. It's the space we occupy in the world. But it's also foundational for lesbians who want to spend just some of their leisure time exclusively with other lesbians. That might include dating sites or art classes or walking groups. Being in a lesbian-only environment gives us space to express ourselves with other lesbians away from the intrusive male gaze. Maybe young lesbians just want to share a flat with other lesbians. Maybe older lesbians want a lesbian-only lunch club. These situations don't require lesbian space only strictly for the purposes of safety or dignity or privacy, which is what a lot of the safe spaces argument was about, although those things are also important to us. But it's also about our right to freedom of assembly and association, our right to meet and mix with whomsoever we choose. Allowing heterosexual men to be defined as women who are attracted to other women, and therefore lesbians, meant that we would be forced to allow such men into our lesbian organisations and activities. Allowing men to be defined as lesbians, I think, does not merely threaten our freedom of association, but completely denies it. And this was one of the key points in the lesbian intervener's submission to the Supreme Court. In reality, the Gender Identity Project has made big inroads into our ability to associate freely because of men's demands to come into our spaces. Many lesbian spaces and events over the years have ceased to exist or have been driven underground. Where are our housing co-ops, our pubs, our disco nights now? And even the Supreme Court ruling isn't going to reinstate those spaces. There's an awful lot of work to do to rebuild that sense of lesbian society and community. Allowing men to be defined as lesbians created an existential threat to the whole concept of same-sex attraction, and this was a second point in our Supreme Court intervention. For Women Scotland had attempted to raise the impact on sexual orientation during the earlier hearing at the Inner House of the Scottish Court of Session. For Women Scotland had correctly said that if sex meant certificated sex, so the sex that you acquired through a gender recognition certificate, then sexual orientation would change on acquiring a gender recognition certificate. some trans women, as they were called, that is, those who were heterosexual men, with a gender recognition certificate, would become legally lesbian and vice versa. This meant a lesbian support group would have to admit them, whereas on the biological definition of sex, it could restrict membership to biological women. Unfortunately, the Inner House was confused. It said in the ruling, "We confess we have not found it easy to follow this particular submission. It is not a necessary inference from the Gender Recognition Act that a person's sexual orientation changes on acquiring a GRC. There is no such thing as being legally lesbian, and we have not identified a problem which would require that sex be referable to biology alone." Those significant gaps in the court's logic persuaded me that we needed a separate lesbian case to be made if the judges would properly understand the issues. The Equality Act was at the heart of the case. It was what those words mean, the words sex and woman mean in relation to the Equality Act. So the Equality Act defines 3 types of sexual orientation: towards persons of the same sex, towards persons of the opposite sex, and towards persons of either sex. Surely, I thought, that is a legal definition of what it means to be a lesbian, a woman who is sexually oriented towards other women. And sexual orientation is also a protected characteristic. So to demonstrate that you've been discriminated on the basis of it, you must first be acknowledged as a lesbian or a gay man. Our submission to the Supreme Court discussed this and also outlined exactly what it means to be a lesbian. Lesbians are females who are sexually oriented. This is our submission, said these things. Lesbians are females who are sexually oriented to the bodies of other females. The defining characteristic of a lesbian is that she is not sexually attracted to male bodies, including penises, testicles, male body mass, and shape. I bet the Supreme Court never expected to hear that. Nor, our wonderful barrister went on, nor is she sexually attracted to certificates. And following on from that, the submission argued a male can never be a lesbian as a matter of fact, whether he is in possession of a gender recognition certificate or not. This is because he will never be female. It cannot seriously be disputed that humans are a sexually dimorphic species. The ruling, when it finally came, included those points almost verbatim. It concluded that defining lesbians as females who share the characteristic of being sexually oriented to other females is coherent and understandable on a biological understanding of sex. Well, quite. It also said that defining a man in possession of a GRC as a same-sex attracted female, in other words, a lesbian, meant that the concept of sexual orientation towards members of a particular sex is rendered meaningless. So that's really, really important. The court also accepted our arguments about lesbian associations. It said allowing men with a GRC to be treated as lesbians would lead to an inevitable loss of autonomy and dignity for lesbians. It would also have practical implications for lesbians across several areas of their lives. In particular, that lesbian associations would be forced to admit men with a GRC, and it accepted that this is having a chilling effect on lesbians who are no longer using lesbian spaces because of the presence of trans women. I realised that we were going to win during the hearing itself, when the chair of the panel, who was the president of the Supreme Court, asked the Scottish Government barrister to clarify that a trans woman without a GRC was to be treated as a heterosexual male, yes, but that a trans woman with a certificate was to be treated as a lesbian, yes. Oh, he said, the difference is pretty stark. Yes. And who thought that the Supreme Court was going to turn into a comedy act? Another judge, Lady Simler, then pointed out that we aren't allowed to ask someone if we possess a GRC. It's a peculiarity of the Gender Recognition Act. So in practice, a lesbian group would have to admit all men who self-ID as women. And it did seem that she wasn't very impressed with that suggestion. So the judgment discusses very many reasons why it's absurd to allow certificated sex to take precedence over the straightforward notion of biological sex. Those arguments are very strong, and the court may well have come to the same conclusion, regardless of the lesbian intervention. But the situation of lesbians is a more extreme example of other circumstances, and I think crystallises the arguments really clearly. Along with pregnant men, the lesbian question was really the only time that the Scottish government barrister found herself unable to put any kind of an argument. Yes. So I am convinced that our intervention, if it didn't win the case, definitely made it unlosable and put the final nail in the coffin of the idea that men should ever be treated as women, never mind as lesbians. So to Jamie, the man on my Twitter feed, I can only say, when a job needs doing, ask a lesbian.